I bet you could feel the tension. They all knew it was the end. See, Jesus had entered Jerusalem to cheering crowds, but he had since challenged and angered the authorities and had since gone into hiding. Jesus had actually just recently told his disciples that he would be betrayed by one of his own, that he would be handed over and crucified. And with betrayal in the air and their last hours together ticking by, they sat together. They sat together, and of all things, the disciples started throwing elbows. It had actually started a few days earlier because some were likely still really mad that James and John had asked to sit on his right and on his left in heaven, and they were angry about that. But I imagine others grew envious when again Jesus sent Peter and John up ahead, not the others, to go and prepare this private upper room and this meal for them to have their last night together. And I can picture Peter and John up ahead of everybody else, getting it all ready, arranging the furniture just so with an eye that they might be the ones sitting beside Jesus. I imagine Peter was thinking, I hope I got it all right. I hope I didn't leave anything out, that I didn't forget anything. Wanting desperately for Jesus to find him reliable and steadfast. After all, it was him, not the others, him, that Jesus had given a special name, Petros, or rock. He had been the one that had been daring enough to speak up when the others were too afraid. And while, sometimes he got it wrong, nobody would question his heart. Nobody would second guess his commitment. And so supper had actually already begun. They were already reclining and eating and drinking when the bickering started up again. It started out as sort of this guessing game about which of them would be the traitor, but it turned into a dispute about which of them was the best, the most important disciple. Was it Judas, the one Jesus entrusted with the money box? Or was it John, who at this very moment was reclining against him? And did he dare to hope that it was himself? Peter, the one that had dared to get out of the boat, the one that was clearly a leader among them, the one that was one of his closest friends. And it's into this scene during this dinner that the Bible tells us what was on Jesus' mind. We're in John 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. On his mind was knowing his exact place in eternity, his perfect authority over everything. His limitless power, his divine origin and destiny. And not only that, but that his enemy's plan of attack had already seated itself in a friend sitting at his table. And with that on the mind, he stood up. And you'd think what would come next would be something majestic. But he doesn't. He doesn't. It says he stands up and he doesn't display his power. He stands up and he doesn't play the leader card. With the weight of the world bearing down on his shoulders, he doesn't grow impatient with their childish jealousies, with their selfish ambitions. He doesn't speak to that at all. Instead of going big, he goes small. And he sets aside his robe and he dresses in the clothing of a slave. Verse 5, then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Without a single word, he begins to wash their feet. Now, if we're going to understand this today, we have to put this in its context. At that time, foot washing was a very often practiced custom in the ancient Mediterranean. Their feet were dirty from day-to-day living. They wore sandals or went barefoot. And long travel on dusty roads only made those conditions worse. And so it was really quite common for a host to provide water so that a person traveling or someone coming as a guest would be able to wash their feet in it on arrival, especially before a meal or a banquet. But most of the time, a person would wash their own feet. They would be provided the water and they'd wash their own feet. In the event that somebody performed that task, somebody else was to wash the feet, it was always someone of low social status and almost always a non-Jewish slave. Because even Jewish slaves weren't required to do that. It was too undignified. Because see, feet were caked in animal feces and mud. They would have been calloused and scarred. And they might even be with fresh wounds and blisters and blood. Even when the rest of you was clean, your feet were dirty. So much so that there was a rabbinical tradition among the Jews that if you were a disciple, if you had decided you were going to give your life and follow a teacher, the disciple was required. It was a wide-held custom. They were required to do every task a slave would do for their teacher, except touch his shoe or unlace his sandal. It was specifically exempted. That's how undignified it was. And so when Jesus gets up, not at the start of the meal, but in the middle of it, to take off his robe, to do this task, everything about it was jarring and wrong. Oh, we have no idea what the disciples were thinking. I can't help but believe that John and Peter, who had set this dinner up, had to be thinking, oh, we didn't provide for foot washing. That's what this is about. We missed something. That's got to be what this is. And we have no idea, but their heads had to have been spinning. Here they are, arguing for position, and Jesus is doing the exact opposite. Verse 6, so he came to Peter, and Peter says, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "What I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter." And Peter said to him, "Never shall you wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Peter, you can actually hear him stammering in disbelief, and he questions Jesus. And we've talked about it throughout this month. I don't know. Was it seeing Jesus like that? This man he'd chosen to follow, stooped down, degrading himself like this, bent low in an act of servitude. Was it seeing Jesus like that? Or was it seeing himself like that? Himself positioned above Jesus, with his dirty feet in the Savior's face. There's a painting that hangs in the Tate Gallery in London by a British painter named Ford Madox Brown, and this is it. It's titled "Jesus Washing Peter's Feet." It was painted in the 1850s, and it's actually quite large. It's 4 feet roughly. And in this painting, originally Brown had painted Jesus stripped down and near naked. He was just in a loincloth and shirtless. But that scene caused such an uproar at the art exhibition. People were so offended by it that the painting went unsold for years until finally Brown had to go back in and put a robe on Jesus. And then the painting did just fine. It's proof that hundreds of years later, we are still not okay with what Jesus did. We don't want to see him like that. But the painting's actually interesting for so many different reasons, one of which is that it gives you this really low-angle view, as if the whole room, even the air, is compressed, and you're focusing in exclusively on the act of foot washing. And Brown chose to show Peter old and angry. He's actually obstinate, while Jesus is the one with his head bowed. And it shows all these disciples in their different stages of expression. Some are in shock, some are in outrage, some are in complete disbelief. One's like this. One's completely despondent. But you see Judas on the left. He's the only one who seems completely unaffected, and he's already unlacing his sandals, as if to say, let's just get this over with because I've got somewhere else to be. And in fact, we know he did. But even though this painting shows Peter kind of resigned, we know from the Bible that it wasn't quite that way. Peter actually stops Jesus twice. First with a question, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" In the Greek, it's, "Lord, you my feet wash?" You hear him stuttering over these words, stumbling over this act. You can almost hear how uncomfortable it makes him to see Jesus, his Lord, his Savior, stoop down. Peter's world is being turned upside down. But he had, I suspect, always wrestled with his self-worth. Because the first time we meet Peter, the first day of their first encounter, when Christ finds Peter, and Peter realizes who it is he's looking at, you know what he says? He says, "Lord, get away from me. Go away from me. I am a sinner. I suspect he struggled most of his life with his self-worth, with believing that he could have fellowship with God. Now, was that his pride? Or was that his shame? Raise your hand if you think it was pride. I'm curious how this is split, because Dave and I have talked about this for about a month. Raise your hand if you think it was pride. A few, 1, 2. Raise your hand if you think it was shame. Almost everybody. Interesting. Dave, I was right. I just write that down. I suspect that pride and shame are two sides of the same coin. William Blake put it this way. He wrote, "Shame is pride's cloak." But I like the way that Max Lucado put it. He wrote this: "Pride and shame, you'd never know they're sisters. They appear so different. Pride puffs out her chest, shame hangs her head. Pride boasts, shame hides. Pride seeks to be seen, shame seeks to be avoided. But don't be fooled, the emotions have the same parentage, and the emotions have the same impact. They keep you from your Father. Pride says you're too good for him, shame says you're too bad. Pride drives you away, shame keeps you away. If pride is what goes before a fall, then shame is what keeps you from getting up after one. Whatever it isn't new. Ever since the garden, we have been simultaneously puffing out our chests and hiding among the trees, believing that our sin, this thing, this most recent part of me, is going to be God's undoing. This is where his love ends. This is where he won't follow. And so Peter speaks for all of us when he says, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Gosh, and I love his response because Jesus doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't say, "How is it that you still can't trust me? We're at the end and you haven't figured it out." He doesn't say that. Knowing who he was, knowing where he came from, knowing where he was going, and with a heart of complete and perfect love, he answers, "You don't understand right now, but someday you will." I hear in that the heart of a parent. My firstborn little girl, Camden, when she was barely old enough to talk, she was fiercely independent, to the point where she didn't know that she couldn't do things. So I remember we would be late to lots of places because I remember standing in the hallway going, "Baby, let me help you put on your shoes." And she'd go, "No, I've got this. No, I've got this." But she quite literally had not yet learned to tie her shoes. So I'd say, gosh, okay. But honey, you don't know how to do that yet? Let me help you. No, I've got this. And that little girl is now 14. And the attitude is still there. No, I've got this. And the cry of my heart, remembering my mother saying things to me that only now make sense, the cry of my heart is, "Baby, you don't see right now. You don't understand right now, but I'm just trying to help you. I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to help. Will you let me help you?" And I think that's Jesus' heart in this moment. You don't understand right now, but will you let me help you? And I bet you could have heard a pin drop Because kind of on a dime, Peter's questioning turns to vehement opposition. Never, never shall you wash my feet. Gosh. And suddenly the tone shifts from disbelief to desperation. And I think we get a glimpse of Peter's fear. We start to sense that this is challenging more than just social constructs and convention. This is somehow firing at the core of Peter's insecurity. It's too far. I can't let you do this. Jesus' response is kind but unequivocal. If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. That phrase, no part with me, it's the same expression that the Hebrews used to talk about their inheritance. He's saying, you won't have fellowship with me. You won't be a part of my kingdom, my ministry, this work. This is what it is to have fellowship with me. You have to let me do this for you. You can't make you clean. You have to let me have it. My holiness is enough for the both of us. Gosh, and I imagine it would have been so tremendously hard for Peter to have this intimate exchange with Christ in front of all the guys. And to swallow his pride in that moment enough to turn his absolutely not to I surrender. But you gotta love Peter because he does it. He does it. Such a humbling moment to admit, I don't have this figured out. You know, honestly, this preaching thing was not what I expected for myself, and it's hard. And last night, actually yesterday afternoon, I texted Travis and said, why do we sign up for this? My family's out bowling. I'm about to vomit. I don't. But y'all, can I tell you, almost every sermon I've had, I get tested in it, like the week leading up. And can I tell you that it's my pride and it's my shame? I want to show up here and get it right. But Jesus, he's saying over and over and over again, and every time, can you trust that I've got it? That I'm enough for both of us? That all I'm asking you to do is be humble enough to try. Just be humble enough to let it go. Let it go. And Peter does it in an almost comical turnaround. He says, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but my head and my hands. Peter says, then give me all of it. I want all of it. And Jesus says, if you're already clean, you don't need to wash everything. See here, Peter didn't need extra washing. Jesus was looking for the change of heart. The washing of the feet was symbolic. They didn't fully understand it at the time. But in that moment, Jesus was, in that act, playing out his own death. I suspect that he was preparing his own heart for how far it was going to be asked to go at the cross. And with this act, with a mind on who he was, where he'd come from, and where he was going, and with love, permeating love on his heart to the end, he showed them, Not with words, but with the act. He showed them what you think matters doesn't matter. This matters. What you think is important, it isn't important. Appearances aren't important. Whether you get out there and you look like a fool, it isn't important. It doesn't matter whether you look like a slave. It doesn't matter what you're dressed in. It doesn't matter who of you is doing what. This matters. Love matters. That's all that matters. Don't let your pride get in the way. Don't let shame hold you back. Let me have it. Let me have the worst of you. Let me have the worst of you, and I will cover it with the best of me. But that kind of intimacy is really hard. We heard Clint talk about it. It's hard. Somehow that's harder. That surrender is harder than keeping up all the charades. It's as hard for me today as it was for Peter back then. To believe that in my vulnerability, in the vulnerability, he loves me all the more. That his love will upend everything to bring me out of hiding. His love will upend everything to bring me back to the table, to bring you back. We know what Peter had to say. What do you say?